The letter was 4 lines long. Elias Carr had not written many letters in his life, and the ones he did write were short because he believed that words cost something. You chose them the way you chose your steps on ice, carefully and only when necessary. 4 lines. That was all he gave. Cook wanted. Small. Light. Resources on the mountain are limited. Cannot afford to feed someone who eats more than they earn. No elaborateness required. Just someone who works. The storekeeper in Cutter's Bluff read it once. Then he read it again. Then he folded it and slid it into the drawer beneath the counter. And he thought, not unkindly, but with the plain honesty of a man who had seen too many of these letters, that Elias Carr was not looking for a cook. He was looking for a sparrow. Before I place this story in front of you, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments right now. Tell me where this story has reached. Because every single week, these stories find their way into new corners of the world, and I want to know yours. The auction was held on a Thursday, the second week of October, 1883. The air that morning had the particular sharpness that comes before the first real cold of a mountain autumn. The kind of air that does not smell like anything, only feels like something, a kind of clean warning pressing against the skin. Cutter's Bluff was not a large town. 40 families. 1 church, 1 general store, 1 livery, the kind of place where every face knew every other face, and strangers were noticed the way a crack in a window is noticed immediately and with some concern about what it means for the cold. By the time the auction began, most of those 40 families had sent at least 1 person to stand in the dust of the main street and watch. These things, the arrangements made in desperation, the letters answered by women with no other choices, the brief and quietly dignified transactions of the frontier were not entertainment exactly. But they were not ignored, either. Elias Carr was there. This surprised people. Elias had not been seen in town in 4 months. He came down from a mountain twice a year, bought what he needed, and left without speaking more than was required. He was not unfriendly in the way that dangerous men are unfriendly. He was simply distant in the way that a man is distant when he has gotten very used to his own silence. He stood at the edge of the crowd, away from the others, one shoulder against the post of the livery. He had the look of a man who had come to say goodbye to something, or perhaps to someone, without letting anyone know that was what he was doing. He watched the street. He did not expect anything. And then Clara Stewart came around the corner of the feed store, and the crowd did something it rarely does in the presence of a woman who has come a long distance, alone, carrying everything she owns in a single bag. It laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, in the way of men who mean harm. It was quieter than that, and, in some ways worse, the kind of sound that comes when a thing appears where a different thing was expected. A sound of surprise curdling quickly into amusement. Because Clara was not a sparrow. She was not small. She was not light. She was not what any letter in that storekeeper's drawer had ever asked for. She was tall, a full head above most of the women in that crowd, and several of the men. Her shoulders were wide in the way that shoulders are wide when they have carried actual weight for actual years, not broad from softness but from work. Her body was heavy, not the heaviness of illness or stillness, but the kind that belongs to the earth, to permanence, to women who do not fall down easily. Her hands were large. Her step was firm. The boards of the wagon she stepped down from creaked under her boots, and she did not hurry, and she did not apologize. And she was, without question, visibly, unmistakably, 8 months with child. The sound moved through the crowd like a thing with its own legs. Clara heard it. There is no question that she heard it, because there was no way not to hear it. It was not far away. It was all around her, close enough to feel as well as hear. The soft percussion of suppressed laughter. The whispers that come half a second after. She set her bag down on the ground at her feet. She stood up straight, and she looked out at that crowd with a face that held no apology and no anger and no shame. A face that was simply, completely, and entirely present, like a mountain that has been standing long before the people arrive to look at it and will be standing long after they leave. She did not look at the ground. Not once. At the edge of the crowd, Elias Carr watched this. He had come to town that morning with an envelope in his coat pocket. Inside it, $10. A note that said for whoever needs it most. He had meant to leave it with the storekeeper. He had meant for it to be his last act of anything. The final small gesture of a man who had decided, quietly and without drama, that the accounting was finished. He had come to look at people one last time. He had not expected to see this. He had not expected to see a woman step down into a crowd that was already laughing and choose, deliberately, in full view of all of them, not to be diminished. He watched her face. He had not felt anything in his chest for 11 years. He had gotten good at that. It was one of his better qualities, he had decided. The ability to feel nothing, to let days pass through him like wine through a gap in the wall, to wake each morning with no particular weight and no particular hope. He was good at enduring things. He was not good at wanting them. But something moved in him now, not loudly, nothing dramatic, just a shift, the way a log settles in a fire that has been burning very low. The storekeeper's voice cut through the noise of the crowd, reading out the terms. Elias did not hear the terms. He saw the officer at the far edge of the group, well-dressed, out of place, watching Clara with a look that Elias recognized from a long time ago, in a very different field. The look of a man who believes he has already decided the outcome of something. Elias knew that face. He had not seen it in 11 years, but a man does not forget the face attached to a lie that cost him everything. His hand was in his coat pocket. The envelope, $10. His goodbye. He raised his hand. The storekeeper recorded the transaction in his ledger with the careful, unhurried hand of a man who has written many things he did not fully understand. Clara Stewart. Arranged to Elias Carr. October 14th, 1883. $10. He blotted the ink. He did not look up. Clara stood to the side while the storekeeper finished his writing, her bag at her feet, her breathing steady. The crowd had largely dispersed. There were animals to feed, wood to split, the thousand small urgencies of frontier life that do not pause for spectacle. A few people lingered at the edges of the street, not quite willing to leave, watching with the particular attention people give to things they have already formed an opinion about and are waiting to see confirmed. The well-dressed man was gone. Clara had noticed when he left. She noticed most things. She picked up her bag. It was heavy. She did not ask for help. Elias brought the wagon around from the livery without ceremony or explanation. It was a plain wagon, a working wagon, not a comfortable one. 2 horses, both of them steady and unremarkable, the kind bred for endurance rather than speed. He had a mule tied to the back, loaded with the supplies he had come down to collect. He tied Clara's bag to the side rail without comment, and he looked at her once, a direct, assessing look, not unkind but not warm, the look of a man measuring weight and distance and what the day's travel would require. He said, "It is 4 hours. The last hour is steep. Can you manage the seat?" Clara looked at the wagon bench. She looked at the road ahead, which vanished upward into the tree line and did not look easy. She looked back at him. "Can the horses manage me?" she asked. It was not a joke exactly. It was a plain question, asked plainly, by a woman who had learned that it was better to ask a practical thing directly than to pretend the practical thing did not exist. Elias considered her weight, the horses, the grade of the last hour, the supplies already on the mule. He made the calculation in the straightforward way of a man accustomed to calculating such things. "I will put more of the load on the mule," he said. That was all. He redistributed the weight without comment, and without any indication that this adjustment was an inconvenience. It was a problem. He solved it. Clara watched him work and said nothing. They left Cutter's Bluff before noon. The first hour of the road was easy enough, a wide, packed track through the lower valley, bordered on both sides by stands of pine and the occasional clearing where cattle grazed against the cold blue sky. The horses moved at a steady walk. Elias held the reins loosely and did not speak. Clara sat beside him with her hands in her lap and watched the country move past her. She had not been in this part of the territory before. She had been in other parts. She had covered a considerable amount of ground in the past 3 months, more than most women would attempt in a year, certainly more than most women 8 months along would attempt at all. But this country was different from what she had passed through. The mountains here were not distant shapes against the horizon. They were immediate. They pressed close on both sides of the road, and rose sharply above the tree line into bare granite, and they had the quality of things that are indifferent to you. Not hostile, simply indifferent in the way of anything that has existed long enough to have stopped noticing. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she liked them. Elias drove without looking at her. At the end of the first hour, when the road began to narrow and climb, he said, "There is water in the canteen behind the seat." Clara reached back for it without difficulty, which seemed to register somewhere behind his eyes, though his face did not change. She drank. She passed the canteen to him. He took it. Small things, unremarkable things, the kind that fill the hours between the moments that actually matter. The second hour was harder. The road climbed through a series of switchbacks, and the horses slowed to a careful pace, and the wagon rocked and jolted in ways that were not pleasant under any circumstances and were considerably less pleasant for a woman 8 months along. Clara did not complain. She braced herself against the seat with one hand and kept her breathing slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to manage things that could not be changed by breathing through them steadily and waiting for them to end. Elias glanced at her once during a particularly rough passage. She met his glance with a steady look that said, plainly, "I am fine. Keep driving." He kept driving. At the top of the switchbacks, the trees thinned and the view opened suddenly. The whole valley below, the town a cluster of small dark shapes. The road they had come up a pale thread unraveling downward between the pines. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she looked forward at the road ahead. Elias said, 2 hours more. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You have never been here," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. "But you said 4 hours. We have been too." He returned his attention to the road. Something in his jaw shifted very slightly in a way that was not quite a smile and was not nothing. The cabin appeared in the last gray light of the afternoon, set back from the tree line on a small shelf of level ground above a slope that fell away sharply to the south. It was a solid structure, well built from timber felled on the site, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and a barn to the east, smaller but equally solid. It was not a beautiful place. It was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to last. Clara looked at it from the wagon seat. She looked at the wood stack to the left of the porch, the way it was positioned, angled wrong relative to the cabin's north wall, exposed to the prevailing draft in a way that would bleed heat out of the split wood before it ever got inside. She looked at the chimney, which was drawing clean. She looked at the barn, which was in good repair. She looked at the porch steps, which were sound. She was making an assessment. She did it quickly and without announcing it. Elias helped her down from the wagon with one hand, steadying her at the elbow without comment. She was heavy and the step down was steep, and neither of them pretended this was anything other than what it was. She found her footing. He released her arm. She stood in front of the cabin. He stood a few feet behind her, waiting, with the particular stillness of a man who is not sure what he is waiting for. She picked up her bag. She crossed the porch. She opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin was cold. It had been empty since morning and the fire had burned down to gray ash. The interior was clean, spare and clean, in the way of a place inhabited by someone who lives alone not from choice, but from circumstance, who keeps things in order because order is the only company available. A table, 2 chairs, a rope bed in the corner, a cook stove against the far wall, shelf along the right side, stocked with careful rows of provisions. A window facing east, covered with oiled paper, letting in a dim flat light. Clara set her bag down. She moved through the cabin slowly, the way she had looked at it from outside, making the same quiet, thorough assessment. She opened the door of the cook stove and looked at the firebox. She examined the flue handle. She moved to the shelves and looked at each of them in turn. The flour, the salt, the dried beans, the hanging strips of venison, the positions of the tools. Elias stood in the doorway and watched her. She could feel him watching. She did not hurry. When she reached the window, she pressed 2 fingers to the oiled paper and felt where the cold came through at the corner seam. She filed this away. Then she turned around and faced him. "Your wood stack," she said, "is on the wrong side. The wind comes from a north-northwest. I could feel on the road. The way it is positioned, The split ends are drawing moisture from the draft, and you're losing heat before the wood comes inside. If you move it 6 feet to the east, the cabin wall will shelter it. Elias said nothing. Also, she said, the oiled paper at the north corner of the window has pulled from the frame. Cold is coming through. It will need to be reseated and sealed before the temperature drops. He still said nothing. She held his gaze. Kitchen, she said. Is this it? He nodded once. Then I will start supper, she said. If you have venison, an onion, and a pot that holds heat, I can have something on the stove in 30 minutes. She turned to the shelf before he answered. She knew from looking at the provisions that he had venison, an onion, and a pot that held heat. She had already decided the menu before she asked the question. Elias stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he turned and went back out to see to the horses. He was outside for a long time. There were the horses to unhitch and water and feed, the mule to unload and stable, the supplies to carry in and stack, the barn to close against the cold. These were the tasks of the evening, and they took the time they always took, and he moved through them in the familiar sequence without thinking very much about anything. Except that when he came back toward the cabin, hands cold, breath clouding, the temperature dropping fast now as the last light left the sky, he stopped on the bottom step of the porch. There was a smell coming through the door. Not complicated, not elaborate, just venison and onion and something underneath, something warm and deeply ordinary, the smell of food being made by someone who knew what they were doing. He had not smelled anything like it in this cabin in 11 years. He stood on the bottom step in the cold, and he breathed it in, and he did not move for longer than he should have, for a man with cold hands and chores finished and a door right in front of him. Then he went inside. The first morning came gray and still. Clara was up before the light. This was not unusual for her. She had been waking before light since she was 9 years old. In a house in Ohio where the fire needed feeding and the younger children needed feeding, and the morning did not wait for anyone to be ready for it. 31 years of early mornings had settled into her body as a kind of permanent habit, the way cold settles into old timber, deep and permanent, and no longer something you think about. She dressed in the dark. She rebuilt the fire in the cook stove from the coal she had banked the night before, working quickly and quietly, the cast iron cold under her palms. She had the water on before the first gray light came through the oiled paper of the east window. She had also, before the water boiled, found a problem with the flue handle. It was stiff, not broken, but stiff from disuse or rust or both, and it did not open to its full position, which meant the draw was reduced, which meant the fire burned slower and produced more smoke inside the cabin than it should. She worked it back and forth with both hands, carefully, the way you work anything that is stuck rather than broken, not forcing, just persuading. It loosened by degrees. By the time the water was boiling, the flue was open fully and the fire was burning the way a fire in a good stove is supposed to burn, clean and hot and without complaint. She noted this in the way she noted most things, filed away, added to the running account. She kept in her mind of what this place was and what it needed. Elias came down from the loft at first light. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder. The cabin was warm, not the thin, grudging warmth of a fire that has been burning a short time, but a settled warmth, the kind that has had time to work its way into the walls and the floor and the air. The smell of coffee was everywhere. Clara was at the stove, her back to him, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to work in small spaces and does not waste motion. She did not turn around when she heard him on the ladder. She said, "Coffee is ready. Seat." He sat. She brought the coffee to the table and set it in front of him and returned to the stove. She did not pour her own cup yet. She was finishing something first. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked at it. The coffee was strong. Real coffee, not the watered-down version he had been making for himself, stretching the supply. He did not know how she had managed it from the same tin he had on the shelf. He did not ask. He drank. Across the table, in the chair she had pulled to a slight angle. Not directly across from him, not beside him, but the edge of the space between, Clara finally sat with her own cup. Her hands around it were large, the knuckles slightly rough, the nails cut short and clean. Working hands. He had noticed them at the auction. He noticed them again now. Neither of them spoke for a time. This was not uncomfortable. That was the thing he noticed, that the silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silence between two strangers who have made an awkward arrangement usually is. It was simply silence. The fire, the wind beginning outside, the creak of the cabin settling in the cold. Finally, he said, "The flue handle." "I fixed it," she said. "I know," he said. "I can feel the difference." She looked at him over her cup. "Waiting. It has been stiff for 2 years," he said. "I know," she said. I could tell from the color of the soot pattern on the back wall of the firebox. 2 years, maybe a little more. He looked at her. She returned her coffee. She asked him, over that first breakfast, 3 questions. Only 3. Where did he keep the tools? Was there a second axe, or only one? How much flour was left in the store, and when had it been bought? He answered all 3. She listened to each answer the way she had listened to the road on the way up, not passively, but with the full attention of someone who is building a picture from parts. After the 3rd answer, she nodded once, as if something had been confirmed, and she did not ask anything else. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he wanted her to ask more. Not because he had things he wanted to say. He had spent 11 years not saying things, and had gotten comfortable with it. But there was something in the quality of her listening, the way she took each answer and actually used it, that made him aware, for the first time in a long time, that conversation could be a practical thing. A tool, not just the sound people made to fill space. He did not say any of this. He finished his coffee and went outside to Splitwood. By the end of the first full day, Clara had reorganized the kitchen shelves. She had not asked. She had not announced her intention. She had simply, in the space of an afternoon, while Elias was outside working, moved things with the logic of someone who cooks for real rather than someone who stores things where they happen to fit. The heavy cast iron pots moved to the lower shelf where they could be lifted without strain. The dried goods moved to the middle where the temperature was most stable. The salt and the small medicines moved to the highest shelf, away from the heat of the stove. The tools she had identified as cooking tools, as opposed to the ones Elias had stored there for reasons she could not account for, she sorted and hung on the 2 available hooks above the stove. When Elias came in at dusk and saw what had been done, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Then he said, "The tin on the 2nd shelf, the round one with the dent." "Move to the top shelf," she said, without turning from the stove. "It has hartshorn salts in it. Should not be near the heat." He looked at the shelf where it now sat. "You know hartshorn," he said. "I know what it smells like," she said. "And I know what happens to it when it gets warm." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My wife kept it there." The word wife landed in the cabin like something dropped, not loud, but with weight settling into the floor. Clara did not move quickly to fill the silence. She let it sit where it had fallen. "I did not know that," she said, simply. "If you want it back there, I will move it." "No," he said. "You are right about the heat." And that was the end of it. In Cutter's Bluff, the conversation had already begun. It started, as conversations in small towns always start, in the places where people gather to conduct necessary business and end up conducting unnecessary business instead. The general store, the space outside the church after Sunday service, the gap between the 2 houses on the north side of the main street where women sometimes stood and talked while their children played in the dust. Elias Carr brought a woman up the mountain. "That one from the auction. Did you see her? Hard to miss her. She is with child. Due any day now, by the look of her." What was he thinking? This was the question they kept returning to, with the particular persistence of people who have decided the answer before they have finished asking. What was he thinking? The letter had been clear enough, small, light, no elaborateness. And what he brought home was the opposite of his own requirements. This meant, to the people of Cutter's Bluff, one of 2 things. Either Elias Carr had gone stranger than they already believed, or there was something about the arrangement that they did not know and that probably reflected poorly on someone. Mrs. Hollis, the preacher's wife, a compact woman of 50 who wore her authority the way she wore her good wool coat, as something that had been earned and would not be surrendered, had the most to say, as she generally did. "That woman," she told the small gathering of wives near the store, "cannot possibly be any use to him up there. In her condition, at her size, what can she do?" The mountain is not kind to people who are, she paused, selecting her word, unprepared. The women listened. Several nodded. One, a younger woman named Rose Mackin, who had come to the territory from Missouri 2 years ago and still had a newcomer's habit of considering things before agreeing with them, said nothing. Mrs. Hollis did not notice Rose's silence. She was already moving on. And in winter, she said, what happens when the real cold comes? What happens then? The real cold came 8 days after Clara arrived. It did not announce itself. The frontier's cold rarely does. It builds in the night while you sleep and is simply present in the morning, fully arrived, with no particular interest in your readiness for it. Elias woke to a temperature that had dropped well below freezing and a wind from the northwest that found every gap in the cabin's construction and investigated each one with cold and thorough fingers. He came down from aloft already calculating, would supply duration of the cold snap, food stores, the horses in the barn. Clara was already at the stove. She had been up for 2 hours. She had also at some point in those 2 hours gone outside. He knew this because her boots by the door were wet, and there was fresh snow on the porch step that bore the clear mark of her passing. He looked at her boots, then at her, with the expression of a man who was not sure which question to ask first. The wood stack, she said, before he could ask either. I started moving it. He looked at her. She was 8.5 months along with a child. The temperature outside was below freezing. The wood in the stack was split pine and cedar, each piece running from 10 to 20 pounds. How much did you move? He said. About a third, she said. I stopped when the wind picked up. I will finish the rest when it drops. He put on his coat and hat and went outside. She had moved approximately 40 pieces. She had carried them in her arms, 3 or 4 at a time, the distance of 6 feet to the shelter position against the east wall of the cabin. The stack, there was already solid and properly positioned, the split ends protected from the wind, the whole thing noticeably more stable than what remained in the original location. He stood in the cold and looked at it. He had been meaning to move that stack since early September. He had not gotten around to it, the way a man living alone does not get around to things that have no immediate consequence. It had been on the list of things he would do when he had time, which meant it had been on the list of things that would not get done until a problem forced the issue. She had done a third of it in the dark, alone, in below freezing temperatures, 8.5 months along. He moved the rest himself in the next hour, working steadily, not quickly. When he came back inside, his hands were red with cold, and he was carrying the last armload. Clara had biscuits on the stove. He stacked the wood he had brought inside by the door and hung his coat, and did not say anything about the wood stack because he did not know what to say about it that would not sound like he was making less of what she had done. And he was not willing to make less of it. So he sat down at the table, and she put a plate in front of him. The blizzard came 3 days later. It came in the night. Real weather, the serious kind, the kind of mountains produce in November that was not a snow shower, but a declaration. By morning, the world outside the cabin windows had narrowed to a moving white wall, and the temperature had dropped to a place where exposed skin became a practical concern within minutes. Elias had anticipated it. He had spent the day before laying in as much wood as possible, checking the barn, securing what needed securing. The cabin was stocked. The horses were sheltered. They could wait out. What he had not anticipated was the supply of wood inside the cabin running shorter than his estimate, because the blizzard ran longer than expected, a full day and then a second day, which was unusual even for this elevation, and which meant that by the morning of the second day, the woodpile inside the door was genuinely low. Going outside to replenish, it meant a trip to the barn and wind that had built to something that pushed hard enough to make footing uncertain, with visibility reduced to a few feet in any direction. He began to put on his coat. Clara was already at the door. She had her heavy shawl doubled around her shoulders and her boots on, and she was looking at him with the direct, uncomplicated look of someone who has assessed a situation and drawn a conclusion. I will go, she said. You will not, he said. Your footing in that wind will be better than mine, she said, because you are lighter. But I can carry more in one trip, which means fewer trips, which means less total time in that wind. 2 trips from me is 1.5 trips from you. He looked at her. She looked back. The wind pushed against the cabin walls. "We will both go," he said. "You carry. I steer." It was not elegant. It was not how either of them would have chosen to do it alone. But it worked, Elias breaking the wind and tracking the direction, Clara behind him loading her arms with as much split wood as she could carry, which was a considerable amount. They made 2 trips. The wind was brutal on both of them. They did not speak outside, because speaking outside was not possible. When they came back in from the second trip, both of them cold through to the bone, Clara set her wood down by the stove and straightened up slowly and pressed one hand to the small of her back. Elias saw it. He said, "Sit down." She started to say something. "Sit," he said again, not unkindly. "I will stack it." She sat. He stacked the wood. He rebuilt the fire until the stove was burning strong again and the warmth had come back into the room. Then he made the coffee, not the way she made it, not quite, but close enough, and set a cup in front of her without comment. She wrapped her hands around it. Outside, the blizzard continued its thorough, indifferent work. Inside, the fire burned. The cabin was warm. And Elias Carr, sitting across the table from a woman he had brought up this mountain with $10 and no clear idea of what he was doing, looked at her hands around the cup and thought, not in words exactly, more in the quiet way that things become true when you've been trying not to think them, that the cold had not won tonight, and that she was part of the reason why. The blizzard broke on the 3rd morning. The silence it left behind was the particular silence that only comes after sustained wind. A silence so complete it has texture, like cloth pressed against the ears. The world outside the cabin was remade. The familiar shapes of the yard had become unfamiliar. The fence posts wore caps of snow. The barn roof carried 2 feet of it, the weight visible in the slight bowing of the roofline that Elias noted immediately and filed as something to address before the next significant snowfall added to it. He went outside at first light to see to the horses. The barn was cold, but the horses were sound. He had built the structure himself 9 years ago with that specific winter in mind. Double-walled on the north side, the stall bedding deep, the door fitted tight. The animals moved and breathed and pushed their noses against his hands in the ordinary way of horses that have been fed and sheltered and have no particular complaint. He stayed with them longer than strictly necessary. He always had. The horses did not require anything of him beyond the practical, and he found this restful. When he came back to the cabin, boots heavy with packed snow, Clara had breakfast on the table. She had also, at some point during the hour he had been in the barn, opened the cabin door and looked at the barn roof. He knew this because when he sat down she said, without preamble, "The south end of the barn roof. The sag." "I saw it," he said. "How old is the structure?" 9 years. She considered this. The ridge beam or the rafters? He looked at her across the table. It was not a look of surprise exactly. He had stopped being surprised by the specific nature of her questions several days ago. It was something more like attention, the look of a man recalibrating, slightly, an estimate he had made. "Rafters," he said. "The center pair. The wood was green when I cut it. I did not have the time to let it season properly." She nodded. "If the next snow comes before you reinforce them, the weight will find that weakness." "I know," he said. "I can help you," she said. "With the lumber, I mean. Carrying and holding." He looked at her. She was 9 months along with a child that was, by any reasonable assessment, arriving within the next 3 to 4 weeks. He was a man who had spent a decade making practical calculations about physical reality, and the calculation he made now was straightforward. "No," he said. She opened her mouth. "There are other ways you can help," he said, before she could speak. "From the ground. I will tell you what I need." She closed her mouth. She considered this. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has determined that an argument is not worth the cost. They ate in the quiet that had become their habit, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. He worked on the barn roof that afternoon, in the cold and clear air that followed the blizzard the way a held breath follows a long exertion. Clara stood below and handed things up, lengths of lumber, the mallet, the iron spikes, with a steadiness and an accuracy that made the work go faster than it would have gone alone. She did not offer unnecessary advice. She watched what he was doing and anticipated what he would need next, and when he reached his hand down from the ladder, what he needed was generally already there. At one point, midway through the afternoon, he said from the roof, "Spike, long one." Her hand came up with it before he finished the sentence. He paused, hand on the spike. Below him, she was looking out across the snow-covered yard with the calm, unhurried expression she wore when she was thinking about something that had nothing to do with what her hands were doing. He drove the spike, he said, without particularly planning to. "Where did you learn to read a roof?" A pause. "My father built houses," she said. "In Ohio. I helped him from the time I was big enough to be useful." "How old?" "7," she said. "Maybe 8. He moved along the roof to the next rafter. "Your father did not mind?" "My father," she said, "minded a great many things about me. That was not one of them." A brief pause. "I was the right size for the work. He was practical about it. He drove the next spike." He thought about that, about a man who was practical about his daughter's usefulness, and about a girl who had grown up knowing her size as a working asset rather than a social liability. He thought about the wood stack she had moved in the dark, the flue handle, the hartshorn salts, the way she had read the barn roof from the cabin door. He thought about his letter. Small, light. He did not say what he thought. He moved to the next rafter. But he thought it for a long time, up on that cold roof in the thin mountain air, working with a steadiness that came from having something to focus on. The satisfying, physical, uncomplicated work of making structure sound again. That evening, after supper, Clara asked him about the names. He did not understand what she meant at first. She gestured toward the floorboards near the hearth, the area he always moved through last thing at night, carefully, deliberately. She had noticed this in the first days. She had not asked about it until now. "Under the board," she said. "You check it every night." He was quiet for a moment. "There is a cedar cross," he said, finally, "and a piece of paper." She waited. She was good at waiting. She did not fill silences with sound the way some people do, people who are uncomfortable with the weight of things. She simply sat and let the space remain open. "Names," he said, "of the men I lost." She looked at the floorboards. "How many?" she asked. He was quiet a moment longer. 17. She absorbed this. "In the war." "After," he said. "In the field. I was a surgeon." The word came out without inflection, the way words come out when they have been carried so long they have worn smooth. 201 operations. Over 6 years. She looked at him. She understood the math. She was not a woman who missed the meaning in a number. 201. And 17 names. "You kept them," she said. It was not a question. She understood why a man would keep the names of the ones he could not save. She understood it without needing it explained to her. He looked at the floor. They deserved to be remembered by someone. The fire moved in the stove. The wind had come back, quieter now, something between a blizzard and a breeze, pressing lightly at the walls. "Yes," she said, "they did." She did not tell him that 17 out of 201 was not a record of failure. She did not tell him that other men had done far worse with far more. She had learned, in her 31 years, that there are things a person carries that cannot be lifted away with correct arithmetic. You could not tell a man who had held 17 men while they died that his numbers were actually good. The numbers were not the point. The names were the point. The faces were the point. So she said none of that. She said, "Were any of them from Ohio?" And something shifted in him. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone watching from outside. But she was not watching from outside. She was sitting 4 feet from him in a warm cabin on a cold mountain, and she felt it the way you feel a change in the air before weather. "Two," he said, "brothers, from a place called Milford." "I know Milford," she said. "Small town, near the river." He looked at her. "I grew up 20 miles from there," she said. Another thing settling between them. Not arranged, not convenient, simply true, the way things that have nothing to do with planning are sometimes true, the way 2 roads that began in different places arrive at the same crossing. In Cutter's Bluff, Mrs. Hollis had refined her position considerably. It was no longer enough to say that the arrangement was impractical. She had moved, over the course of a week, to a more specific concern. one she expressed to the women who gathered at the store on Thursday for their regular provisioning, with the careful language of someone who has decided that concern sounds better than judgment. "I worry," she said, "about the child." This was a more effective opening than her previous approaches, because it was harder to argue with. Worrying about a child was not the same as criticizing a woman. It occupied higher moral ground. "A woman in that condition," she continued, "on a mountain, in winter, with a man who has not spoken to anyone in years. Who will be there when the time comes? Who will help her?" Rose Mackin, who had said nothing the previous Thursday, said something now. "She managed to get herself up that mountain alone," she said. "She managed the auction alone. I expect she will manage." Mrs. Hollis looked at Rose with the particular expression of someone whose charitable concern has been interrupted by an inconvenient point. "Managing," she said, "is not the same as being cared for." Rose Mackin did not respond to this. She bought her flour and her salt, and she left. What Rose did not say, because she had only met Clara once, briefly, at the edge of the auction, in the half hour before the thing began, was that Clara Stewart had impressed her in a very specific way. Not with her size, which everyone seemed unable to move past, and not with her condition, which everyone seemed to find either tragic or scandalous, depending on their disposition. She had impressed her because of the way she looked at the town. Not with fear, not with hope, with assessment. The way you look at a piece of ground you might have to cross. Elias found the boot 3 weeks after Clara arrived. He had not been looking for it. He had gone into the barn to check on a loose shoe on the gray mare, and he had moved the saddle from its hook to examine the girth, and the boot had been tucked behind it, Clara's left boot, the one she wore for heavy outdoor work, and it had fallen when he moved the saddle. Something fell out with it. A letter, folded many times. The paper soft with handling, the kind of softness that comes from being read and refold and read again many times over a long period. He picked it up. He should not have read it. He knew that. He held it for a moment, looking at the exterior, a man's handwriting on the outside, the letters deliberate and slightly uneven in the way of a man who had learned to write as an adult rather than a child. The name on the outside was not Clara's. It was his. Elias Carr, the mountain. "If you find this man, give him this." He stood in the cold of the barn, the letter in his hands. The gray mare shifted and blew a breath of warm air at his shoulder. He unfolded it. The handwriting inside was the same, slow, deliberate, a man writing something important and wanting to get it right. The date was 8 months ago. The paper had the particular quality of something written by someone who knew they were running out of time to write things. "Elias, you do not know me. My name is Daniel Stewart. You saved my life at Caldwell Creek in the summer of 1864. You do not know my name then either. I was just a man on a table. But I have known yours for 19 years, and I have carried what you did for me every day since. I am dying. My wife Clara does not know how soon. I am writing this because she will need somewhere to go, and I cannot think of anywhere better than up the mountain to the man who knew what to do when everything was falling apart. She is stronger than she looks. She is stronger than anyone I have ever known. To write by her, Elias. That is all I ask. You gave me 19 years. Give her a place to stand. Daniel Stewart." Elias stood in the barn for a long time after he finished reading. The mare moved. The cold pressed in through the gaps in the barn walls. Outside, the wind was beginning to build again from the north, the particular sound it made when it was bringing more weather down from the higher elevations. He folded the letter. He stood with it in his hands. Daniel Stewart, Caldwell Creek, summer of 1864. He could not remember Daniel Stewart specifically. There had been so many men on that table, and he had learned early in his work not to hold the faces too clearly, because holding the faces too clearly cost you the steadiness that the next man on the table needed from you. He had learned to work and release. Work and release. But Caldwell Creek he remembered. He remembered the day and the field and the particular quality of the light that afternoon. The way it had come through the canvas of the field hospital at a low angle, not quite warm enough to be summer light, more like the light of something trying and not quite succeeding. 19 years. Daniel Stewart had carried him for 19 years, and then had sent his wife, 8 months along, 3 months of travel, alone, up a mountain. To a man who had put $10 in an envelope and called it goodbye. Elias looked at the letter in his hands. Then he looked at the cabin through the barn door. The smoke from the chimney rising straight up in the still air, the warm shape of the lit window against the gray afternoon. He put the letter in his coat pocket. He went back inside to finish checking the gray mare's shoe. But his hands, when he picked up the hoof, were not quite steady. And that, for a man who had operated on 200 men with the same hands and never once felt them shake, was something he did not quite know what to do with. He did not tell her about the letter that night. He came in from the barn as the last light left the sky, hung his coat on the hook by the door, washed his hands in the basin, and sat down at the table. Clara put supper in front of him, venison stew, thick with the dried onion she had been rationing carefully and a handful of the dried herbs she had brought in her bag from wherever she had come from. He ate. She ate across from him. The fire worked in the stove. The wind built and then settled and then built again outside. He said nothing about the letter. This was not dishonesty exactly. It was the behavior of a man who needed time to place a thing before he spoke about it, who understood, from long experience with things that required careful handling, that you did not pick up something fragile until you were sure of your footing. He needed to be sure of his footing. Clara woke in the night, not from the child, though the child was making its presence known in the way it had been making itself known for weeks now, a kind of steady, internal insistence that had become simply the background condition of her existence. She woke because something in the cabin had changed while she slept. She lay still for a moment and identified it. The sound of Elias moving. Not from the loft. He was already on the ground floor, which meant he had come down without waking her, which meant he had been quiet about it deliberately, which meant he did not want to wake her, which meant something had him out of his sleep, and he had chosen to deal with it alone. She had learned, in the weeks since she arrived, to read the sounds of this cabin the way she read most things, by paying attention and drawing the obvious conclusions. She knew the sound of him banking the fire before bed. She knew the sound of him crossing to the water basin in the dark. She knew the sequence of his mornings, the order of his tasks, the particular rhythm of a man who has lived alone long enough that his habits have hardened into something close to ceremony. This was not any of those sounds. He was at the table, sitting, not moving. She lay in the darkness and listened to the quality of his stillness, because stillness has quality, texture, the way silence does. Some stillness is restful. Some is the stillness of a man sitting with something in his hands that he does not know how to put down. She got up. He had the letter on the table in front of him. The kerosene lamp was burning low, turned down to almost nothing. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table, not touching the letter, just looking at it. The way you look at a thing you have read many times and are still not done reading. He looked up when she came in from the back room. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked like a man who had known, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that she would come. Clara looked at the letter on the table. She looked at his face. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "You found it," she said. "In the barn," he said, "when I moved the saddle." She nodded slowly. Her hands came together on the table in front of her. Those large, steady hands, fingers laced, the posture of someone settling in for a conversation they had been expecting for some time. "How long have you known?" he asked. "That you would find it eventually," she said. "Since the first week. You are thorough. You check everything." He looked at her. "You could have told me." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them moved slightly, the flame bending in some small current of air from the window seam, throwing her face into a brief, soft shift of shadow and light. "Because," she said, "I wanted you to know me first, before you knew why I came." He said nothing. "If I had handed you that letter at the auction," she said, "or on the road up, or the first night, you would have looked at me through it. Everything I did, everything you saw, you would have measured against Daniel's words, against what he asked you to feel." She paused. "I did not want that." Elias looked at the letter, then at her. "He said you were stronger than you looked," he said. "Daniel," she said, with a small, private expression that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, always undersold things. The lamp moved again. Outside, the wind had gone quiet, that temporary stillness that comes in the middle of the night when the cold is deepened past the point where even the wind moves easily. He was at Caldwell Creek, Elias said. Yes. I don't remember him specifically. He said this carefully, as a man says a thing he is not sure will be received well. There were a great many men. He knew that, she said. He never expected you to remember him. He remembered you. She unclaced her fingers and laid her hands flat on the table. He used to say, when Daniel talked about things that mattered, he did not say very many words. He used to say that the measure of a man was what he did when there was nothing in it for him. He said you worked on men who were already dying, men anyone else would have moved past. He said you never moved past anyone. Elias was very still. He watched you for 3 hours in that field hospital, she said. Before it was his turn on the table. He watched how you worked. The fire in the stove ticked. A log shifted, settling deeper into the heat. He said you talked to them, she said quietly. The ones who were going. You talked to them while you worked, so they would not be alone in it. Elias looked at the table. His jaw was set in the way of a man holding something in place by the force of long practice. Clara did not look away from him. She did not fill the space with softer words. She had said the true thing, and she left it where it was. After a long moment, he said, Daniel, what did he stopped? Started again. At the end. Was it? It was not hard, she said. He was not afraid. He was tired at the end, but not afraid. She paused. He talked about you the last week, more than he talked about almost anything else. Elias said nothing for a long time. Then, he should not have sent you alone. 3 months of travel. In your condition. He did not send me, she said. He told me where you were. What I did with that information was my own decision. He looked at her. I had nowhere else that made sense, she said. It was not self-pity. She said it the way she said most things, with the directness of someone reporting a fact. And Daniel trusted you. That was not a small thing. Daniel did not trust easily. Neither do you, Elias said. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. Neither do I. He did not sleep again that night. He banked the fire properly and went back up to the loft and lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about Daniel Stewart watching him work from a cot in a field hospital in 1864, and about a woman traveling 3 months alone across 4 states, and about $10 in an envelope that were supposed to be a goodbye. He thought about the 17 names under the floorboard. He thought about his wife, Margaret, about the particular quality of the last morning he had seen her, which had been ordinary in every respect, which was the thing about last mornings that no one told you, that they were ordinary, that you moved through them without any knowledge that they were last. He thought about the surgeon's hands that had saved 200 men and arrived 40 minutes too late for the one that mattered. He had built his guilt carefully over 11 years, the way you build a structure meant to last, with good material and proper attention to the joints. He had given it everything it needed to stand. He had fed it with the silence and the isolation and the 17 names, and it had stood, and he had let it stand because tearing it down would have meant deciding what to do with the space it had occupied, and he had not known what to put there. Clara Stewart, asleep in the back room of his cabin with another man's child under her heart, was the first thing in 11 years that had made him consider the question. He did not arrive at any conclusions before morning came, but he considered it, and considering it, after 11 years of not considering anything, was itself something. The next morning she was at the stove when he came down, as she always was, and the coffee was on, as it always was, and neither of them said anything about the night before for a long time. He sat. She brought the coffee. She sat across from him. Then she said, "There is something else you should know." He looked at her over his cup. "The child," she said, "is not Daniel's." The cabin was very quiet. She held his gaze without flinching, without apology, without the performance of shame that the world outside this cabin would have required from her. She simply looked at him and let the words occupy the space between them. "There was a man," she said, "before Daniel died, a federal man, well-dressed, the kind of man who wears authority like a second coat and expects it to open doors." Her voice was level, but something underneath it had gone careful in the way of someone navigating around a thing they have decided not to touch directly. It was not, she stopped. Started again, more simply. "I did not choose it." Elias set down his cup. "He had debts of Daniel's," she said. "He used them, when Daniel was already past knowing. The fire in the stove worked. The morning light came through the oiled paper of the east window, flat and pale and cold. He expected me to stay, she said, when the child came. He had an idea about what that would look like, how that would be arranged. Something moved across her face, not fear, because she had clearly moved past fear some time ago, but the residue of it, the shadow a thing leaves after you have outrun it. I left before he could arrange it. The auction, Elias said. I made sure he knew where I was, she said. I wanted him to come, to bid. I knew that if he bought me back at auction, it would look like a legal transaction, and I would have no ground to stand on. She looked at him steadily. I needed someone to bid first, someone he wouldn't push against easily. Elias looked at her. You knew who I was, he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was a man working out the shape of a thing he had only seen part of. Daniel told me your name, she said, and that you had been a surgeon, and that you had been in the territory 11 years. A pause. I did not know you would be at the auction. I only knew that if I was going to go anywhere, it should be somewhere he would not easily follow. A mountain, Elias said. A mountain, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the man at the auction, well-dressed, standing at the back of the crowd. She looked at him. You saw him, she said. I knew his face, Elias said, before I knew yours. The thing between them, the connection they had each been arriving at from different directions, along different roads, carrying different weights, settled into the room like the warmth of a fire that has been burning a long time. Not sudden, not dramatic, simply present, fully arrived, in the way of things that have been building since before either of them understood what was being built. He is the one who filed the charges against you, she said. It was not a question. She had worked it out. She was a woman who worked things out. Captain Aldous Vane, Elias said. The name came out flat, stripped of everything except its own shape. He wanted my post. I had something he wanted access to, supply routes, medical stores. I refused to move them through his hands. A pause. He filed a desertion charge. I was 2 days right away operating on a field of men who would have died without me. He knew that. Another pause, quieter. I did not come back to contest it. Margaret was, by the time I got word. He stopped. Clara did not fill the silence. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking, looked at the table. He ruined 11 years of your life, she said. And he is the father of this child. Yes, he said. And you raise your hand at the auction, she said, when you saw his face. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression he had not seen before. Not gratitude exactly, not relief, but something beneath both of those, something older and more durable. $10, she said quietly. $10, he said. She looked at her hands on the table. Those were the same $10 you put in the envelope, she said. It was not a question. She had worked that out too. She had likely worked it out weeks ago and been waiting for the right moment. He did not answer. He did not need to. Outside the cabin, the cold pressed against the walls with its patient, impersonal weight. Inside, the fire worked in the stove. The morning light moved through the oiled paper of the window, a little warmer now as the sun climbed, and the smell of the coffee sat in the air between them. And the words they had each been carrying for weeks occupied the space on the table between the two cups like something finally set down. Elias looked at the window. He said, Vane will come. Yes, she said. Not for you, he said. Not anymore. He will come for me. He looked at her. He does not know that I know what I know, but he will not leave a loose end on a mountain. Clara looked at him steadily. Then we should be ready, she said. And the word we, simple, plain, 2 letters, the most ordinary word in the language, sat between them in that warm cabin on that cold morning, and neither of them remarked on it. But both of them heard it. They did not speak of Vane again that day. This was not avoidance. It was the practical wisdom of people who have learned that some conversations need to be had once, completely, and then set aside while the hands find work, because work is how the frontier processes things that the mind cannot fully hold. You split the wood. You mend the fence. You check the horses. And the thing you cannot solve today sits at the edge of your awareness like weather on the horizon, present but not yet arrived, and you use the time between now and its arrival to be ready. Elias spent the morning reinforcing the barn's north wall, where a gap had opened in the chinking between 2 lower logs. A gap small enough to miss in summer, significant enough in deep winter to matter to the animals. He mixed the chinking mortar in the cold, working quickly because the mixture would not stay workable long in this temperature, pressing it into the gap with the flat of a wooden tool worn smooth from years of exactly this use. Clara spent the morning inside. She had been watching, over the past week, the way the cabin's heat distributed, where it gathered, where it escaped, which corners stayed cold regardless of how well the stove was burning. She had done this the way she did most things, without announcing it, simply paying attention. Now she took the spare wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the rope bed. Not her blanket, the spare, the one that had been folded there and used since she arrived, and she cut it with the sewing shears into 3 pieces, sizing each one by eye with the accuracy of a woman who had been measuring by eye her whole life. She packed 2 pieces into the worst of the cold corners, wedged behind the shelf brackets where the wall met the floor. The third she reshaped into a door seal, stitching it quickly with the heavy thread from her bag, tacking it to the base of the cabin door, where the draft came through strongest. When Elias came in at midday and the cabin was noticeably warmer than when he had left, he looked at the door, then at the corners, then at her. She put food on the table. He sat down. "The blanket," he said. "The spare," she said. It was doing nothing, folded in the chest. He looked at the door seal. He looked at the corners. He made the same kind of assessment she always made, practical, thorough, arriving at the obvious conclusion. "That will make a difference through January," he said. "That is what it is for," she said. They ate. 4 days later, the child announced its imminent arrival with the calm certainty of something that has been patient long enough. Clara woke before dawn with the first real contractions. Not the false warnings that had been occurring for the past 2 weeks, which she had recognized for what they were and said nothing about, but the genuine article with the particular quality of something that has moved from possibility to fact. She lay still for a few minutes in the dark, timing the intervals with the steady internal clock she had developed over the past months of paying attention to her own body the way she paid attention to everything else, carefully, without panic, drawing accurate conclusions. The intervals were manageable. She had time. She got up. She dressed. She built the fire in the stove up from the bank coals to a full burn, because she would need the heat and she would need the hot water, and she understood, from what she knew and what she had prepared for, that the next several hours would demand everything she had. She had been preparing for this since her 3rd week on the mountain. She had inventoried what was in the cabin. She had noted what was missing and what could substitute. She had reorganized the medical supplies she found in Elias's chest, the clean linen, the carbolic, the instruments that told her, more clearly than anything else he had said, exactly what kind of man had lived in this cabin before he became only a man who lived alone. Surgical instruments, maintained, wrapped in oilcloth, stored with the particular care of someone who could not bring himself to put them away permanently, but could not bring himself to use them either. She had said nothing about finding them. She put the largest pot on to boil. Then she went to the base of the loft ladder. "Elias," she said, not loudly. She did not need to be loud. She had noticed early on that he slept lightly, the sleep of someone who has spent years on alert, and that a single word at the right volume would bring him up from it cleanly. A pause, then movement in the loft. "It is time," she said. He came down the ladder with the focused, unhurried speed of a man moving from sleep into a situation that requires him to be awake and useful. No wasted motion, no fumbling, just the immediate orientation of someone whose mind comes back from sleep already working. He looked at her. He assessed the way she was standing, the quality of her breathing, the slight tension across her face that she was managing with visible and practiced effort. He crossed to the stove and checked the water. He went to the chest. He stopped with his hand on the lid. Clara watched him. She watched the pause, the moment of a man standing at a threshold he had not crossed in a long time, his hand on the thing he had not touched for 11 years, the thing that had made him the man who saved 200 people and could not save himself. "Elias," she said. He turned. "I know what those instruments are," she said. "I know what it costs you to open that chest." She held his gaze. "Open it anyway." Something moved through him. She saw it, not on his face exactly, but in the quality of his stillness, the way a thing moves through water rather than across it. He opened the chest. What followed was not dramatic in the way that people who have not witnessed difficult and genuine work imagine it to be dramatic. It was hard. It was long. It demanded from Clara a quality of endurance that had nothing to do with courage as a feeling and everything to do with courage as a practice. The simple decision, made continuously, not to stop. And it demanded from Elias Carr something he had not given anything in 11 years. His full attention. His complete skill. The part of him he had locked in an oiled cloth and put in a chest under a rope bed on a mountain and told himself he was done with. His hands did not shake. This surprised him, or rather, he was aware of a moment, the first moment when he expected them to shake, when he braced for the tremor that seemed like it should accompany the reopening of something this long closed. And they did not shake. They did what they had always done. They were steady and certain, and they knew their work the way hands know work that has been done long enough to become part of the body rather than just a skill. He talked to her through it, not the way a surgeon talks to a patient to manage them. Not the practiced, professional reassurance of a man performing a role. He talked to her the way he had talked to the men on the tables at Caldwell Creek, the ones he had described to her the night before without knowing that she would be on that table the next day. He talked to her because silence, in the middle of something this difficult, is its own kind of cruelty, and because he was underneath the 11 years of practice distance, still the man who had understood that. He said practical things. He told her what was happening. He told her what to do and when. He told her the truth about how it was going at each stage, because she was not a woman who would have accepted anything less than the truth, and because he had learned long ago that people in pain face it better when they're not also facing the additional burden of being managed. She did everything he told her. She was, as Daniel had written, stronger than she looked. She was stronger than anyone Elias had encountered on any table in 6 years of war surgery. And he had encountered remarkable people, people who had endured things that should not be endured, who had stayed present through pain that should have taken them away. Clara Stewart stayed present. She breathed when he told her to breathe. She pushed when he told her to push. She held on when he told her to hold on. And she held on with the particular grip of someone who has decided in advance not to let go. And when the child came, just past midnight, into the cold cabin air, into the kerosene light and the warmth of a fire that had been built up to meet it, and took its first breath and announced itself to the mountain with the ancient, ordinary, extraordinary sound of a new person arriving. Elias held it in his steady surgeon's hands, and something passed through him that he did not have a word for. Not joy exactly. Older than joy. The thing underneath joy, the ground it grows from. He wrapped the child in the clean linen he had prepared. He put it in Clara's arms. He stood back. Clara looked at the child. She looked at it the way she looked at most things, with full, complete attention, taking it in, making the assessment. But this assessment was different from every other she had made in this cabin. This one had something in it that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the fact that some things, when they arrive, simply take the breath. She looked up at Elias. He was standing at the side of the room, his hands hanging at his sides, his face doing the thing it did when he was feeling something he had not given himself permission to feel. "Sit down," she said quietly, "before you fall down." He sat. She looked back at the child. After a long moment, she said, "He is healthy." "Yes," Elias said. "You are certain?" "Yes." She nodded. She accepted this with the same directness. She accepted everything, fully, without performance. Then she said, very quietly, not quite to him and not quite to herself, "Daniel would have liked this." Elias looked at the floor. "Yes," he said. "I think he would have." He let her sleep before the gray light came. He sat by the stove through what remained of the night, keeping the fire and listening to the sound of the child's breathing from the back room. That small, specific sound, steadier than you expect, more deliberate, as if the business of breathing is being taken very seriously by someone who has just discovered it is necessary. He had his hands in his lap. He looked at them. These hands, that had done what they had always done when he finally let them. He thought about Margaret. He thought about her the way he always thought about her. But tonight the shape of the thought was different. Not the familiar weight of the grief and the guilt and the 40-minute difference that had defined 11 years of silence. Tonight, it was something more like conversation, as if she were in the room, not in the aching way of absence, but in the way of presence. The way a person you have known very well occupies a room, even when they are not in it. He thought about what she would have said about tonight. He thought she would have said something practical and something devastating in the same sentence, because that had been her way. She had been a woman who did not separate the practical from the profound, who understood that they were the same thing at the bottom. He thought she would have liked Clara, not sentimentally, not in the easy way of a story that arranges its characters conveniently, but genuinely, the way one capable woman recognizes another, with respect that has nothing to do with liking and often precedes it. He sat with this for a long time. Then he got up and put more wood on the fire. By mid-morning, word had reached Cutter's Bluff. It arrived the way most things arrived in Cutter's Bluff, through the specific channel of a man who had business that took him past the lower trail and saw the smoke from the cabin chimney burning higher than usual for that hour, which he mentioned to the livery owner, who mentioned it to his wife, who knew what high smoke from a mountain cabin at that hour generally indicated, and said so to the woman she was speaking to, who happened to be Rose Mackin. Rose Mackin listened to this chain of information with the same quiet attention she brought to most things. Then she went home and packed a basket. She arrived at the cabin that afternoon, having borrowed a horse from her husband and made the climb alone, which was not nothing, and knocked on the door with the practical directness of someone who has come to help rather than to judge. Elias opened the door. Rose held up the basket. "Soup," she said, "and bread from this morning, and a length of flannel I did not need." Elias looked at her for a moment. He had not had a visitor in this cabin in 11 years. The concept required a brief adjustment. He opened the door wider. Rose came in, set the basket on the table, and looked toward the back room with the expression of a woman assessing what is needed. "Is she well?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said. "The child?" "Healthy," he said. Rose nodded. She began unpacking the basket with efficient, unsentimental hands. "I will leave the flannel for the child. The soup will keep on the stove." She paused. "She will need rest. Real rest. Not frontier rest. Actual rest for several days. Can you manage the cabin?" Elias looked at her. "I managed it for 11 years," he said. Rose looked back at him with the brief, direct expression of a woman who is deciding whether a man is being dry or defensive. She decided dry. "Good," she said. She finished unpacking. She put her coat back on. "I will come again in 3 days. If she needs anything before that, send word to the livery." She moved toward the door. Then she stopped. She turned back. "Mrs. Hollis," she said, "will have something to say about all of this. She generally does." A pause. "I thought you should know that she does not speak for everyone in this town." She looked at him steadily. "She does not even speak for most of us." Elias said nothing. Rose nodded once, as if something had been settled, and went out. He closed the door behind her. He stood in the cabin for a moment in the middle of that ordinary afternoon. The fire working, the soup Rose had brought beginning to warm on the stove, the sound of the child breathing in the back room, steady and certain and entirely new. He thought about the envelope in his coat pocket, the $10 that were supposed to be a goodbye. He thought about Daniel Stewart watching him work from a cot in 1864. He thought about a woman who had crossed 4 states alone to arrive at the right place. He thought about his hands, not shaking. He went to the back room door and looked in. Clara was asleep, finally, deeply, with the completeness of someone whose body has simply taken the rest it needs regardless of permission. The child was beside her, wrapped in the clean linen, its face arranged in the perfect, unconscious seriousness of the newly arrived. Elias stood in the doorway. He did not go in. He did not need to go in. He stood there long enough to confirm what he already knew, that both of them were well, that the fire would hold, that the soup was warming, that the cabin was sound, that the cold outside had no way in that he had not already addressed. He had addressed everything he could address. For now, that was enough. He pulled the door, softly closed, and went back to the stove to tend the fire. Outside, the mountain held its position against the winter sky, patient, indifferent, enormous, the same as it had always been. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Something small and permanent and entirely without ceremony. The way the most important things always change. The child needed a name. This became apparent on the third day, when Rose Mackin came back as she had promised and asked, with a practical directness that seemed to be her defining characteristic, what they were calling him. Clara said she had not decided. Rose accepted this without comment, left more bread and a length of good flannel she claimed was extra, but almost certainly was not, checked the child with the experienced hands of a woman who had raised four of her own, pronounced him sound, and left. After she was gone, Elias sat at the table with his coffee and did not say anything about the name. Clara, feeding the child by the stove, did not bring it up either, but it sat in the cabin between them for the rest of the day. Not heavily, not with any particular urgency, but with the quiet persistence of an unanswered question that both people in a room are aware of and neither has yet decided how to approach. That evening, after supper, Clara said, "Did you know any good men named Daniel?" Elias looked up from the harness he was mending by the lamp. A buckle had cracked in the cold, and the repair required patience and good light, and the particular kind of focused attention that keeps the hands busy while the mind does other work. "Several," he said. "Did they deserve a name?" He considered this seriously, the way she asked it seriously. "One of them particularly," he said. "A man from Kentucky. Steady. The kind of steady that does not announce itself." Clara looked at the child in her arms. "Daniel," she said quietly. Not a question. A sound she was testing, the way you test the weight of a thing before deciding to carry it. The name sat in the air of the cabin. "It is a good name," Elias said. He returned to the harness buckle. "It suits him." Clara looked at the child for another moment. Then she said, "Daniel James Stewart." James, Elias noted but did not say, was the name of one of the 17. He had never told her the names. He did not know how she knew. Perhaps she did not know, and it was simply a name she carried from somewhere else in her life. He did not ask. Some things did not need to be pulled apart to be true. On the 5th day after the birth, Elias found the tracks. He had gone out early to check the fence line on the east side of the property, a section that had been concerning him since before the blizzard, where the posts had been set in ground that froze and heaved unpredictably, working the bases loose over successive winters. He found 3 posts that needed resetting before the spring thaw made the whole section unreliable. He also found, in the snow at the lower edge of the property, 2 sets of boot prints. Not fresh, 2 days old at least, partially filled in by the light snowfall that had come 2 nights ago, which meant they had been made before that snowfall, and he was only finding them now because the angle of the morning light had caught the shadows and the filled-in depressions. 2 men, standing. Not moving through, standing for some time by the depth and distribution of the impressions, looking upward toward the cabin. He crouched and studied the prints for a long time. One set was larger, heavier, the boot heel distinctive, a city boot, not a work boot, the heel higher and squarer than any boot a working man wore in this territory. The other set was smaller, pointed, the kind of boot worn by a man who wanted to look like something he was not. He stood up. He looked upward toward the cabin. From this position, on a clear day, you could see the cabin plainly, the smoke from the chimney, the shape of the structure, the lamp in the window at night. Someone standing here at night, with a lamp burning inside, would have been able to see movement through the oiled paper of the window clearly enough to count the people inside. He looked back down at the prints. 2 days ago, he had been inside most of the evening. Clara had been up and moving. The child had been difficult that night, and she had walked the cabin floor for 2 hours with him before he settled. The lamp had been burning until well past midnight. Someone had stood at the edge of this property in the dark and watched that lamp. Elias reset the 3 loose fence posts. He worked steadily and without rushing, because rushing would not change what had already happened and the posts needed resetting regardless. He finished the work, packed his tools, and walked back to the cabin at his ordinary pace. Inside, Clara was at the stove. The child was in the wooden cradle Elias had built in the first days after the birth. Not elaborately, nothing he was not capable of making from the lumber he had on hand, but solidly, the joints fitted properly, the runners smooth. Clara had lined it with the flannel Rose had brought. Clara looked at him when he came in. She read his face the way she read most things, quickly and accurately. "What did you find?" she said. He told her. All of it. The prints, the position, the boot heel, the timing. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the stove. "How long?" she said. "Before he comes up, or before he does something for below?" "Either." He considered this honestly. "He is not a man who does his own difficult work," he said. The prints were 2 sets. He brought someone with him, which means he is paying for muscle he does not have himself. He paused. "He will not come in winter up that road, with deep snow still on the upper grade. The risk to himself is too high, and the advantage is ours. We know the ground, and he does not." He looked at her. "He will wait for better conditions. Late February at the earliest. More likely March." Clara absorbed this. "And the exoneration," she said. "The federal investigator you mentioned." "I have not seen him," Elias said. "I do not know if that is still coming or if it ever was." She nodded slowly. She was thinking. He could see her doing it, the focused, sequential quality of her thinking visible in the way her eyes moved slightly, working through a problem from its edges toward its center. "The storekeeper," she said. "In town. He knows people. He knows who comes through and who is asking questions." "Briggs," Elias said. "Yes. Can you get word to him? Without going to town yourself?" "Rose Mackin," he said. "She will be back in a few days." Clara nodded. "Then we use the time." He began teaching her to shoot that same week. This was not a romantic notion. It was a practical one, the same kind of practical calculation he made about the wood stack and the fence posts and the barn roof. Clara was in the cabin alone for significant portions of every day. The cabin had a rifle above the door and a revolver in the chest. She knew neither weapon. He started with the revolver, in the yard, on the first clear afternoon, cold enough that their breath showed, but warm enough that the hand stayed functional. He showed her the loading and the unloading first, how the cylinder worked, how to check it, how to clear a misfire, because a weapon you understand is a different thing from a weapon you simply hold. She listened with the same total attention she brought to every practical instruction. Then he showed her the stance. She was not a small woman, and the revolver fit her hand better than it fit some men's. He corrected her grip once, the thumb position, and after that she did not need correcting again. Her first shot was wide. Her second was closer. Her third hit what he had set up as a mark. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the third shot had not already said. By the end of the afternoon, she was consistent enough that he was satisfied. Not expert. You did not become expert in an afternoon, and he would not have said so if she had. But reliable, which was what the situation required. "The rifle next," he said, unloading the revolver. "Tomorrow," she said. She was tired, genuinely tired, in the deep physical way of a woman whose body was still recovering from what it had accomplished 6 days ago, and who had been standing in the cold for an hour. She would not have admitted this without the qualifier of tomorrow, which told him she was not stopping, only pausing, which he had come to understand was the characteristic she could not turn off even when it would have been reasonable to. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They went inside. Rose Mackin came on the 7th day and took the message to Briggs. She did not ask what it was about. She read the sealed note Elias gave her, looked at him with the expression of a woman who has drawn an accurate conclusion and is deciding whether to say so, and decided not to. She put the note in her coat pocket and said she would have Briggs's answer by the following Thursday. She also brought, on this visit, something she had not brought before, a piece of news. She delivered it the way she delivered most things, directly, without softening, because she was a woman who had decided that the kindest thing was usually the accurate thing. "Mrs. Hollis," she said, standing at the table with her coat still on, "has been speaking to the circuit preacher, the one who comes through in February." She paused. "She has raised the question of the child's legitimacy. Formally, she wants it on record." The cabin was quiet. Clara, sitting at the table with the child, did not change expression. She looked at Rose with a level, assessing look she had worn in the auction crowd when the laughter had moved around her like weather. "What does that mean practically?" she said. It was not quite a question. She was thinking aloud, working through the implications. "It means," Rose said carefully, "that when the preacher comes through, she will put it to him that the arrangement here is irregular, that there is no record of a marriage, that the child has no clear standing. She looked at Clara steadily. She wants the child to be taken to the county orphan board. The child made a small sound in Clara's arms. Clara did not look down at him. She kept her eyes on Rose. She cannot do that alone, Elias said. He was standing by the window, and his voice was level. The preacher has no legal authority over the county board. No, Rose said, but Aldous Vane does. The name landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. Rose looked between them. She saw, in the quality of the silence that followed, that this was not new information, that the name had been in this room before, carried by both of them, and that its arrival in a third person's mouth had simply confirmed something they had already known was coming. He came through Cutter's Bluff 4 days ago, Rose said. Stayed at the hotel one night. Spoke to Mrs. Hollis. A pause. And to the county land registrar. Elias looked at the window. Clara looked at Elias. The land, she said. He turned from the window. His face had the particular quality it wore when he was working through something. Not anger, not fear, but the focused, cold clarity of a man who has identified a problem and is already calculating its solution. If the charges against me were never formally cleared, he said, the property registration is contested. A man with federal connections and a sympathetic county registrar could claim the land was never legitimately held. He paused. He does not want me in prison. He wants the mountain. There are silver deposits, Clara said. It was not a question. Elias looked at her. The way you position the supply routes, she said. The way he wanted access. It was not the medical stores. She met his eyes. It was never the medical stores. He said nothing for a moment. Then there was a survey. 1861. I saw the report. I should not have seen it. It crossed my desk by error. Silver in the upper ridge. Significant amounts. Vane saw the same report. A pause. He did not know I saw it. He filed the charge 8 months later. Rose was listening to this with the expression of a woman who is storing information with careful accuracy. Then we need the investigator, Clara said. Before February. Before the preacher. I have sent word twice, Elias said. No answer. Send a third time, Clara said. Through Briggs. Not through the regular post. Briggs knows the federal circuit riders. He knows who carries what and where. She looked at Elias steadily. Vane has been working the county registrar and the church. He is building from the ground up. We need to cut the ground from under him. Rose Mackin looked at Clara with an expression that was new. Not the practical assessment of a neighbor deciding how much help was needed, but something closer to genuine respect, the kind that arrives when a person turns out to be more than you already thought they were. I will talk to Briggs myself, Rose said. Not through a note. That night, after the child had settled and the fire had been banked and the cabin had gone quiet, Elias stood at the window for a long time. The moon was up, full and cold, the particular white light of a winter moon on snow that illuminates everything and warms nothing. The yard was still. The fence line was visible all the way to the tree line. The road below was empty and white. He looked at all of it. The yard, the fence, the barn, the tree line, the road. He had built this place with his own hands in the first year after Margaret died. He had built it the way a man builds something when he has nothing else to do with his grief, thoroughly, and with more care than strictly necessary, because care was what he had left when everything else had been taken. He had built it to last, and it had lasted, and he had lived in it alone for 11 years and called that sufficient. He looked at it now, the same cabin, the same yard, the same mountain, and it was not the same. It was not the same because there was a child breathing in a back room, because there were 2 cups on the table, because the wood stack was on the right side of the wall, and the flue handle opened fully, and the cold corners had wool packed into them, and the smell of something cooked by someone who knew what they were doing had settled into the walls the way a smell settles when it has been there long enough to belong. It was not the same because Clara Stewart had come up this mountain with her boots in the snow and her bag in her hand and her eyes level, and had looked at his cabin the way she looked at everything, with the full, unsparing attention of someone who intended to make it work, and had proceeded to do exactly that. He thought about Vane standing at the lower fence line 2 nights ago in the dark, looking up at the lit window. He thought about the 17 names under the floorboard. He thought about the envelope with the $10, his goodbye, that had become something else entirely. He had been a man for 11 years, waiting to be finished. He had built the waiting into the structure of his days the way you build a room into a house, with walls and a door and a specific, defined purpose. He had gotten good at it. He had made it his. But you cannot make a room yours forever when someone else has moved into the house. He turned from the window. Clara was sitting at the table. She had not gone to bed. She was sitting with her hands around a cup of cold coffee, watching him with a level, patient look she wore when she was waiting for him to arrive at something. He sat down across from her. He said, "When this is over, when Vane is handled and the charges are cleared and the land is settled," he stopped. He began again. "I am asking this plainly, because I do not know another way to ask things." She waited. "Will you stay?" he said. The fire ticked in the stove. The moon moved its cold light across the floor. Clara looked at him for a long moment, not hesitating, not calculating, but doing what she always did, which was taking a thing in fully before she responded to it. "Elias," she said. "Yes. I crossed 4 states in winter," she said. 8 months along. Alone." He waited. "I did not do that," she said quietly, "to leave." The cabin was very still. He nodded once. The nod of a man who has received an answer he did not let himself expect, and is now in the unfamiliar position of not knowing what to do with the space where his expecting used to be. He picked up his cup. She picked up hers. Outside, the moon continued its cold and patient work across the sky, and the mountain held everything in its enormous, indifferent stillness. The cabin, the yard, the fence, the sleeping child, the 2 people at the table. The way it had always held everything. But it was holding more now than it had held before. And that, Elias thought, looking at his cup, was not nothing. That was, in fact, the opposite of nothing. And somewhere, in the thin, cold air of that mountain night, in the silence between one breath and the next, something that had been closed for 11 years opened very quietly, without ceremony, the way the best things open, like a door that was never really locked, only forgotten. The federal investigator arrived on a Tuesday. Not the way Elias had imagined he might arrive. Not with authority and announcement. Not with the bearing of a man carrying official weight into a situation that required it. He arrived on a tired horse, alone, in the flat gray light of a February morning. And he tied his horse at the post outside the cabin with the careful movements of a man who has been riding for a long time and whose body is informing him of this fact. Elias watched him from the window before opening the door. The man was perhaps 50, thin, a federal coat that had seen considerable use, a leather satchel worn at the corners. He stood for a moment after tying the horse and looked up at the cabin with an expression that was neither hostile nor particularly warm, simply the expression of a man who has arrived at the destination of a long errand and is taking a moment to confirm it is the right one. Elias opened the door before he knocked. The man looked at him. "Elias Carr," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Elias said. "My name is Whitmore. Federal Circuit Investigator, 9th District." He reached into the satchel and produced a document, folded, sealed, official. "I have been trying to reach you since November. Your post in Cutter's Bluff has been unreliable." "Come in," Elias said. Whitmore sat at the table and drank the coffee Clara put in front of him with the gratitude of a man who has had a long and cold morning. He spread the documents on the table with the careful, practiced movements of someone who has handled a great many documents and understands that the order in which they are presented matters. Clara sat to the side, not absent, present in the cabin at the edge of the table with the child in her arms and her eyes on the papers. Whitmore had glanced at her once when he came in, noted her, noted the child, and returned his attention to his work without comment. He was, Elias thought, a man who had seen a great many arrangements on the frontier and had long ago stopped being surprised by any of them. "Captain Aldous Vane," Whitmore said. He said the name the way you say the name of a problem you've been working on for a long time, with a flat, tired familiarity. "Filed the charge of desertion against you in September of 1864. Court-martial conducted in absentia, November 1864, conviction recorded." He smoothed the first document on the table. "Vane died in October of last year. Tuberculosis." He made a deathbed statement, witnessed by 2 men, one a federal marshal, one a physician, in which he recanted the charge in full, stated that the charge was fabricated, that he had falsified the timeline of events to show you absent without cause, and that your actions on the day in question were in fact a direct response to his own orders, which he had given and then denied. He paused. He also stated the reason. Elias said nothing. The survey, Whitmore said. 1861, Upper Ridge. He did not want you in a position to contest his claim once the war was finished. He looked at Elias across the table. He filed the charge to remove you. He did not expect you to simply leave. I had a reason to leave, Elias said. Whitmore looked at him briefly. He did not press this. The exoneration is formal and complete. The conviction is expunged from the military record. The land registration, which was contested by Vane's office in December through the county registrar, is invalid. The basis for the contest was the criminal record, which no longer exists. He produced a second document. This restores full title to the property. Your name, uncontested. He slid both documents across the table. Elias looked at them. He did not pick them up immediately. He looked at them the way you look at something you have waited for long enough that its actual arrival feels less like relief and more like a weight you did not know you were still carrying being set down somewhere outside your body. 11 years. A lie. A man's jealousy over a map showing silver in the Upper Ridge. 11 years of silence and 17 names and a floorboard with a cedar cross and $10 in an envelope. All of it built on a fabrication by a man who had died of tuberculosis in October, talking to a federal marshal and a physician, trying to square something he had carried too long. Clara's hand moved across the table and came to rest on the documents. She did not push them toward him. She simply put her hand there, near them, the way you put your hand near something to confirm it is real. Elias picked up the first document. He read it. He set it down and picked up the second. He read that too. Then he folded both carefully and held them in his hands. Whitmore was finishing his coffee. He produced a third document, shorter, a single page. This is the formal record of Vane's statement regarding the survey and the property. It names his actions as fraudulent interference with a federal land claim. In the event anyone in the county registrar's office attempts to resurrect the contest, this supersedes any instrument they have on file. He looked at Elias. I would suggest registering it with the territorial court as soon as the season permits travel. Briggs and Cutter's Bluff, Clara said. The storekeeper. He knows the territorial circuit judge. They serve together. She paused. He can have it in front of the right person within the week. Whitmore looked at her. A brief, genuine assessment. That will do, he said. He finished his coffee. He stood. He put on his coat with the measured movements of a man resettling himself for the road. At the door he stopped. He turned back. He looked at Elias. The deathbed statement, he said. Vane asked that it be delivered personally. He was specific about that. Not by post, personally. He paused. He said you deserve to hear it from a man's mouth, not read it off paper alone. Elias looked at him. He also said, Whitmore continued, with the careful tone of a man delivering something he was asked to deliver and is delivering faithfully regardless of his own feelings about it, that he was sorry. For what that is worth from a man 11 years too late. The cabin was quiet. Thank you, Elias said. Whitmore nodded. He went out. The sound of his horse moving away down the trail faded and then was gone, and the mountain silence came back and around the cabin the way it always did, complete and immediate, as if the sound had never been there. Elias sat for a long time after Whitmore left. Clara did not speak. She fed the child and settled him in the cradle and came back to the table and sat across from Elias with her hands in her lap, and she let the silence be what it needed to be, which was large and which was his. He had the 3 documents on the table in front of him. He was not reading them. He was looking past them at the table's grain, the familiar worn surface of the wood he had made this table from 9 years ago. Cedar for the lower slope, milled by hand because there had been no mill close enough to matter, and he had needed something to do with his hands that first winter. He had built everything here with his hands. The table, the chairs, the barn, the cradle in the back room, the fence posts on the east line, the cabin itself, every log fitted, every gap chinked, every board of the floor laid level. He had built it all in the service of something he had told himself was endurance, but which he now understood, sitting at this table on this February morning with the exoneration documents in front of him, had actually been punishment. He had built a life that was sufficient and nothing more, because sufficient and nothing more was what a man deserved who had lost the one thing that made more than sufficient possible. That was what he had told himself. For 11 years. And it had been, like the charge against him, a fabrication. Not malicious, as Vane's had been. Simply wrong. The story a man tells himself when grief has been going on so long, it has become indistinguishable from identity. He looked at the cradle in the back room doorway. He looked at the 2 cups on the table. He looked at Clara's hands in her lap. Those large, steady, capable hands that had moved as would stack in the dark and fixed his flue and read his barn roof from the cabin door and held on through the longest night this cabin had ever contained. He said, "I need to show you something." He lifted the floorboard. Clara stood beside him and looked into the space beneath, the small, dark hollow he had cut into the subfloor 9 years ago with the specific intention of putting something in it that he could not put anywhere else. The cedar cross lay on a folded piece of oilcloth. Beneath the cross, the paper, the list of names, written in the small, precise hand of a surgeon who had learned that precision was a form of respect. He reached in. The cross was not there. He looked into the hollow, the oilcloth, the paper with the names. But the cross, the cedar cross he had cut himself from a branch off the tree at the east fence line, the one he had put there the first winter as the closest thing to a marker he could make for the men who had no markers, was gone. He looked at Clara. She reached into the pocket of her apron. She held out to him, the cross, small and plain, cedar gone silver gray with age. She had carried it in her apron pocket. She turned it over. On the back, worked into the wood with the point of a knife, in letters small and careful, "You can still be of use to someone." He looked at it. He looked at her handwriting, the letters deliberate, slightly uneven in the way of someone who had carved in wood rather than written on paper, taking care with each stroke. He said, "When?" "3rd week," she said. "You want to check the fence in the morning. I found it when I was sweeping near the hearth." The board had shifted. She paused. "I read the names on the paper. I put it back. I kept the cross." She met his eyes. "I thought it needed something on it." He turned the cross over in his hands. "Front, back, front again. You can still be of use to someone." He thought about Whitmore on the road, about the deathbed statement of a man who had waited too long to tell the truth, about Daniel Stewart on a cot in a field hospital in 1864 watching a surgeon work for 3 hours before it was his turn and carrying that for 19 years, and sending his wife across 4 states in winter to the mountain at the end of it. He thought about $10 in an envelope. His goodbye. Coming back. He thought about what Clara had said at the auction, when he had asked, days later, quietly, what she had thought when the storekeeper read out that someone had bid. She had said, "I thought, whoever that is, they are still trying. And if they are still trying, then so am I." He held the cross in his closed fist. Then, for the first time in 11 years, in the plain morning light of the cabin, without ceremony, without warning, he wept. Not loudly, not in the way of a man performing grief for an audience. In the way of a man who has been holding something for so long that when it finally releases, it releases all at once, and the only thing to do is let it go. Clara did not move away. She did not speak. She sat beside him on the floor, near the open board, and she stayed there, present and steady, the way the mountain stayed, not solving anything, not taking it from him, simply there, solid and unhurried, for as long as it took. It did not take long. He was not a man who did anything for longer than necessary. When he was done, he wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at the cross in his palm. Clara said nothing. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Put it back." He looked at her. "Not under the floor," she said. "Put it somewhere you can see it." He looked around the cabin, at the walls, the shelves, the mantel above the stove that he had built wide enough to hold things, but which had held nothing for 11 years. He got up. He put the cross on the mantel. He stepped back and looked at it there, the small cedar cross, silver gray, with its 7 words carved on the back that he could not read from here, but did not need to read because he knew them now by the weight of them in his hand. It looked, on that mantel, like it had always been there, like it had been waiting for someone to put it in the right place. Spring came the way it always comes to high country. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. Snow that fell and melted and fell again. The creek below the property running first slow and dark under ice, and then fast and loud as the melt came down from the upper elevations. The horses restless in the barn. The first birds back in the tree line, audible before visible, their sound arriving days before they could be seen. Elias noticed all of it the way he always noticed the seasons change, as a series of practical facts requiring practical responses. The fence post that needed resetting now that the ground was thawing. The barn roof to be properly finished before the spring rains. The kitchen garden to be broken and planted while the ground was workable. He noticed it differently this year. Not because the facts had changed. The fence posts were the same fence posts. The barn roof was the same barn roof. But he moved through the work with something that had been missing for long enough that he had forgotten it was missing. The quality of a man who is doing the work because the work leads somewhere, not because the work is all there is. The child was 3 months old and had developed, in those 3 months, a specific and apparently permanent interest in the sound of Elias's voice. This had been established early and conclusively. Daniel James would settle for Clara, would settle for silence, would settle for the particular motion of the cradle, but would settle fastest and most completely for Elias talking. Not reading, not singing, just talking. In the low, level voice Elias used when he talked to the horses or worked through a problem aloud. Elias had responded to this discovery with the same practical acceptance he brought to most things. If the child required talking, he would talk. He talked about the fence posts. He talked about the barn roof. He talked about the survey of the upper ridge and the silver that Vane had wanted and that now, legally and completely, belonged to this mountain and therefore to whoever held the title to it. He talked, occasionally, about Margaret. Not to Clara, not yet, but to the child, which was perhaps the same thing, eventually, as talking to Clara, but with more time and less directness, which suited him. He told Daniel James about a woman from Ohio who had known her own mind completely and had not spent a single day apologizing for it. He told him that there were women like that the world tried to make them apologize anyway, and that the ones who refused were worth paying attention to. Daniel James listened to all of this with the serious, unfocused attention of a child 3 months old, which Elias found, to his own surprise, to be entirely sufficient. Mrs. Hollis came in March. She came with 2 other women from the church, which was either moral support or witnesses, and she came to the door of the cabin with the expression of a woman who has decided that a duty is a duty regardless of how it is received. Elias opened the door. She looked at him. Behind him, the cabin was warm and ordered, the fire going, the smell of something cooking, the cedar cross on the mantel, the cradle visible through the doorway of the back room. She opened her mouth. He said, "She is resting." Mrs. Hollis looked at the mantel, at the cross, at the 2 cups on the table, at the cradle. She took in all of it with the comprehensive, involuntary assessment of a woman who has spent a lifetime noticing the details of other people's domestic arrangements. She said, "I know why you came," Elias said. His voice was level, not unkind, but not accommodating. The circuit preacher has the correct documents. The land is registered. The child's name is recorded at the county seat. He looked at her steadily. "There is nothing here that requires your attention." Mrs. Hollis held his gaze. She was not a woman who yielded easily. She had built her position in Cutter's Bluff on the durable foundation of never yielding easily, and she was not about to surrender it on a mountain in March. But she was also a woman, and this Elias did not know, and Clara did not know, but it was true, who had stood in front of a crowd 30 years ago and heard them laugh, and who had spent every year since ensuring that she would never be on that side of the laughter again, who had made herself the woman who defined the edges of acceptability in Cutter's Bluff so that she would never again be outside them. She looked at the cross on the mantel. She looked at Elias. Something moved through her expression, quickly, not quite visible, the way things move through people when they see something that touches a place they've spent a long time keeping covered. She said, "The child is well?" "He is," Elias said. She nodded. Once. The nod of a woman recalibrating something. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not paying close attention, but recalibrating. She said good. And then, after a pause that contained more than the pause of a woman simply ending a visit, good. She turned and went back down the porch steps. The two women with her followed. Elias watched them go. He closed the door. Clara was standing in the doorway of the back room. She had the child against her shoulder. She had been awake. She had heard all of it. She did not say anything about Mrs. Hollis. She said, "Come and eat." He came and sat. She put food in front of him. They ate in the quiet that had been there since the beginning. The quiet that was not absence, but presence. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who have learned that not everything needs to be said because not everything needs translation. On a morning in April, the first morning that was genuinely warm rather than merely less cold, the first morning the cabin door could be left open and the warmth outside equaled the warmth inside, Elias was sitting on the porch steps. He had not sat on these steps in 11 years. He had passed through them thousands of times. He had never sat on them, because sitting on them was the behavior of a man who had somewhere to sit and was choosing to sit there. And for 11 years he had been a man who was simply passing through, moving between the work and the interior dark, with no particular interest in the quality of the light in between. He sat on the steps. The yard was ordinary in the April morning, still muddy from the thaw, the fence line needing one more post on the east side, the barn roof sound and finished, the wood stack correctly positioned against the east wall of the cabin where the wind could not reach it. From the open door, behind him, came the smell of bread. Clara had found, in the second month, that the cabin stove held heat differently than she had first assessed and had adjusted her process accordingly. And the bread now came out the way bread should come out from a stove that is properly understood. From the same open door came the sound of Clara's voice, low, even the particular tone she used with the child that was not quite singing and not quite speaking, but something between, something that had no name, but which settled into the air of the cabin the way the bread smell settled, like something that had always been there and had only now found its proper place. A neighbor on the lower road lifted a hand as he passed with his wagon. Elias raised his hand in return. This small thing, this ordinary, unremarkable exchange between a man on a porch and a man on a road. He had not done it in 11 years. He looked at his hand after he lowered it. Then he looked out across the yard at the fence, the barn, the tree line, the upper ridge where the silver sat in the rock, and had always sat there, patient and indifferent, waiting for someone to decide what it was worth and what they would do with it. He thought about what he would do with it. He thought about the school that Cutter's Bluff did not have and probably needed. He thought about the road up the mountain that was passable in summer and a problem in winter, and what a proper graded road would cost, and whether it was worth the effort. He thought about Rose Mackin's husband who had 3 children and a farm that was good land being worked by too few hands. He thought about Briggs in the store, who knew everyone and everything and who had sent word twice this winter to people in need without ever mentioning it to anyone. He thought about what a man could do if he had resources and time and was willing to be of use to someone. Clara came to the door. She stood there with the child against her shoulder, looking out at the yard with the same quality of attention she brought to every space she stood in, taking it in, making the assessment, arriving at the obvious conclusion. She looked at him on the steps. He looked up at her. "It is a good morning," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the yard, the fence, the barn, the tree line, the ridge. "Elias," she said. "Yes." "Your letter," she said. "The one you sent to Cutter's Bluff." He waited. It said, small light, no elaborateness. She looked at him. "Did you ever wonder, if you had gotten what you asked for, what would have happened?" He thought about this honestly, the way she always made him think about things, fully, without the comfortable shortcut of the answer that costs nothing. "I think," he said slowly, "I would have been polite and correct, and I would have stayed exactly where I was." She looked at him. "And now," she said. He looked at the yard, the morning, the ridge, his hand that had lifted to a neighbor on a road. "Now," he said, "I'm sitting on the steps." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she came out and sat beside him, carefully, with the practical management of a woman settling onto a step with a child on her shoulder. And she looked out of the same yard, the same morning, the same mountain that had held all of it, all of them, all along. The child made a small sound. Content. Investigating the morning air with the serious attention of someone encountering it for the first time. The bread smell drifted through the open door. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird that had been back for 3 days but had not yet been seen announced itself from a branch that was just beginning, very slowly, to consider the possibility of leaves. Elias looked at his hands in his lap. The same hands that had held the cross, that had been steady when everything else was not, that had done what they were built to do when he finally let them. He had written a letter that asked for small and light and no elaborateness. He had gotten a woman who moved wood in the dark and fixed the flue and read the barn roof and crossed 4 states alone and carved 7 words in a cedar with a knife and sat on a floor in silence with a man who had forgotten how to be held and held him anyway, without making a production of it, without asking for anything in return except the plain, durable thing of being allowed to stay. He had gotten a child who settled for the sound of his voice. He had gotten a morning on the steps. He had gotten, out of $10 that were meant to be a goodbye, an entire life that was meant to be a beginning. He had been, in the letter and in much else, completely wrong. He had never in his life been more grateful to be wrong. The mountain held them there, the man, the woman, the child, the morning, in its enormous and patient silence, the same way it had always held everything. But it was holding more now, and the more was everything. From the mantle of a cedar log cabin on a mountain in the Montana Territory, a small cross watched all of it, silver gray, plain, 7 words on the back that only one person had carved and only one person had needed to read, on a night when the only thing standing between a man and his own ending was a woman who had not looked at the ground. She never did. Not once. Not ever.